After 3 years of work, our follow-up to the Meat Eater Fish and Game Cookbook is here. It's the Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, campfire, and camp stove. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside, from grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Get your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com or buy it wherever books are sold.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, home of the modern whitetail hunter. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your guest host, Tony Peterson. And today I'm speaking with wildlife researcher and whitetail expert, Dr. Karl Miller. All right, folks, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, which is brought to you by First Light. You might notice that this is not the voice of the well-mustachioed Mark Kenyon. Mark actually sent me an email last week saying that he was going to work on his extreme ironing skills and was really going to test his limits with his latest challenge. I don't know anymore, you guys. I don't have the energy to care. If you're wondering if Mark is as strange as he sounds, trust me, it's orders of magnitude worse when you get to know him. Anyway, I hope he cheats death with this latest hobby of his. And moving on, today I'm speaking with Dr. Karl Miller. There is no one out there who has contributed more to the body of whitetail research than this guy. He's an absolute wealth of knowledge who has given back an awful lot to the whitetail community. And on this show, we dive pretty deep into how deer hear and how good they are actually at hearing, which is going to surprise you. And then we get into how well deer can actually smell and why that's so tough to study. This episode is pretty heavy into science, but it will make you a better deer hunter, I promise. I think you're really going to like it. Karl Miller, it is an honor to get to talk to you.
You made me nervous by saying an honor.
I've read your stuff for a long, long time, man. And I got to ask you, are you the most published whitetail researcher on the planet?
Well, Tony, first of all, you said you read it for a long time. That makes me sound really old, but which of course
I meant the last couple of years.
No, actually, I am. And I think right now I have published more in the scientific literature than anybody else has on whitetails.
After taking a look at the list of stuff that you have out there, I would believe that. Because I've interviewed quite a few deer biologists and wildlife researchers, and you have a resume, man. I'm so glad to have you on. There's a couple things I really want to talk to you about, but first, where did the whitetail obsession come from?
One of the things I wanted to comment on is what you just said earlier about, having such a long list of publications and stuff in my career and stuff. And, the reason for that is I've just absolutely been blessed by the people I've had the opportunity to work with. A lot of good colleagues, a lot of good mentors, and particularly a lot of great graduate students. And those are the workhorses that got a lot of this stuff done. I come up with some ideas and just turn them loose on stuff. And we put together a really good team at Georgia, and that team is continuing on with the people who replaced me since I retired. So, but my obsession, I grew up in northern Pennsylvania in the big woods with the traditional deer hunting camp up there, lived and breathed whitetail deer from probably the time I came out of the womb, I guess. Long tradition. It may have actually come back. My birthday's in August, so I kind of backdated 9 months. And I think I was a product of, hello, honey, I'm home from deer camp,
You're the first. I've interviewed a lot of people. Nobody's ever traced back their conception date quite that way. Well, I shouldn't say that. Nobody's ever openly admitted it.
So I guess my dad got his buck that year.
Yeah. Oh man, that's awesome. So it was a family thing. It was the social thing. You know, you just grew up with it, and you just parlayed it into a really, really long career, huh?
Yeah, and starting out in college, I wanted to go into wildlife, but listen to guidance counselors and parents and stuff. They said, well, you're not going to get a job in wildlife, so you got to go into something else. So I started off in another field, and ultimately, by the time I was working on my master's degree, I thought, you know what? There's somebody getting jobs in wildlife and wildlife management with deer. If you're good, you'll get the job. So that's where I made my switch, and haven't looked back since. I mean, it's been an incredible opportunity for over 40 years to work with the animal you love to work with.
So when you were kind of kicking around the idea of going into this field, you had people in your life who said there's no money there, there's no jobs there, you got to look somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. But like I said, somebody has those jobs, and it might be a little more competition out there, but if you're good, you're going to find one.
Yeah. I had the same thing happen to me. I always wanted to be an outdoor writer. And when I went to college, a lot of people were like, listen, man, you got to get a real job. There's like 10 guys in the world making a living doing that. And, lucky for me, I was just young and dumb enough and didn't have enough holding me down to not give it a shot. And it changed the arc of my life, just pursuing that.
Right. And you've done well with it.
It's been fun. I've been lucky. I feel lucky, man. I want to talk to you. You've studied so much different stuff in the whitetail world, but there's two things I got to talk to you about. And it's how well a deer can hear, or I should probably rephrase that, how deer hear compared to us, and how we kind of should be leaving behind what we know about hearing because of how we hear, and how we should be thinking about how they have evolved to hear. And I want to do the same thing with their noses. So let's start with deer hearing, because I know you've bumped into this a lot, where we just as humans, we bring in this biases of like, okay, we know what hearing is like. We know how we hear. And so we look at deer and go, well, they must be way better at it because we give them a lot of credit, but that's not necessarily the case from your research.
Yeah. And this is the easy one, deer hearing, because to tell you the truth, deer hearing is really not that much different than ours, which really surprises a lot of people. There's been two different studies that have been done that looked at that. We did one at the University of Georgia. I had a graduate student named Gino D'Angelo, who's now on the faculty there. And he did one where we looked at auditory brainstem response, which actually measures the signal in the deer's brain in response to different sounds, different frequencies and different intensities of sound. And that study was done basically physiologically. And then there was a study done out of the University of Toledo by a father-son pair named Hefner. And they actually did what is called a behavioral, that's a hard word to say, an audiogram, where they actually trained the deer to respond if they heard a sound. And interestingly, both studies found essentially the same thing. The deer hearing range is very similar to ours. Their best hearing is probably a little bit higher frequencies than ours. We probably hear in the 2 to 4 kilohertz range. They hear in the 4 to 8 kilohertz range at their peak. But if you overlay the two curves, they are almost identical. Which so they may hear a little higher frequencies better. We may hear low frequencies better, but it's not that much different. But the surprising thing that people don't realize is that their ability to hear is not that much better than ours. It's essentially about the same.
So how do you test that? So when you guys did the study and you're looking at the brain scan, I'm assuming that's a great way to not have any false positives or any kind of ambiguous data, right? Like the brain lights up, they heard it. And then they do this study down in Ohio, and it's a conditioned response thing, probably a food thing or something, I'm guessing. Right. So how do you figure out, like, because I think if you ask the average hunter, they would say, well, of course a deer can hear something farther away than us, and of course they can pinpoint it better. Like it would be, for most people, it'd be a given. But how do you test to figure that out? To go, their hearing's not that much better than ours.
Okay, now you're going into a place that I want to get. There are some caveats to this.
Okay.
and that's related to the external ears that a deer has. This is what the deer's hearing capability is when the sound is played into the deer's ear. And both of it is done with different frequencies, and you use different intensities, different volumes of the sound to get the response. But the difference is the deer have these large external ears they're called pinnae, which have multiple functions, one of which is to accentuate sound that's entering into the ear. So it's like when you put your hand to your ear when you're trying to hear something. It actually funnels more of that sound into your ear. So when a deer has its ears cupped towards an object that's producing that sound, it actually accentuates that sound. But on the flip side, when they're turned away from something, it decreases the sound. So when the deer's ears are pointed forward, it's not hearing as well behind. Or when its ears are backwards, it's not hearing as well forward. So when a deer's ears are cupped towards you, that's when it's going to have the best ability to pick up that sound. That also helps a lot with the ability to localize the source of the sound, define the directionality, because that extends the distance between the two ears out further. And the distance between the ears is what helps you to identify where the sound came from. Mm-hmm. So one other thing to think about this is, though, and I know a lot of hunters will say, oh, you know what, I've been sitting on deer stand and I've been watching deer right under my stand, and all of a sudden deer picked up its head and looked in a different direction, like it heard something and I never heard something. So why is that? Well, the way I kind of explain that is, deer spend their entire life, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days in the woods. They know what they're supposed to hear and what they're not supposed to hear. You know what you're supposed to hear in your house or not supposed to hear in your house. If you drop a nickel versus a dime on the kitchen floor, you'd know the difference, right? Or if you're driving your truck and it starts to make a weird sound, you say, that's not normal. My wife can't do that, but most people can do that. So they know what they're supposed to hear. How many times have you been on a deer stand and had a deer in front of you and you heard a rustle behind you and you turn around and it's a squirrel and the deer never picked its head up? The deer knew what it was supposed to hear and knew what was natural and what was unnatural. And that's what they're picking up on, is the unnatural sound out in the woods, I think.
What this reminds me of, I think it was Steve Ranella that was talking about this when he spent some time down in the Amazon with natives who, these indigenous people, their life is condensed down to like 20 square miles of jungle. And so they are just tuned into that. It's an area that we, like living in the modern world where we live, we don't think of things that way, right? Like you think of the city, and you go to the grocery store or whatever, or maybe you go to your farm. But their entire existence is boiled down to that, whatever 20 square miles it is. So they know the trees, they know the plants, they know the animals, they know, there's new tracks coming in here or whatever. And I always think about that with deer. When you look at, if you use like a square mile as just like a generic home range, and then you think about that's their entire existence. And we look at time a little bit differently, right? We have long lives compared to them. So they spend 1 year there. And we think that's, like a young, whatever, little Forky or something, a year and a half old out there. But he's spent his entire existence, and maybe he's dispersed or something, but you've got just a little piece of ground that everything that's there is what they encounter every day.
Right.
And it's a different thing. So they're so in tune to that environment compared to how we probably perceive it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You can almost see it in kids. And when I was teaching at the university, you could tell kids that grew up with spending a lot of time out in the woods versus ones who didn't, that spend most of their time on a Game Boy or something, because the kids that spent a lot of time out in the woods could see things. They picked up on things. They just knew what was supposed to be there, and if it was something unusual, they picked up on it, where the other kids didn't. They didn't have the appreciation for it.
Yeah. Well, I ran into that. I take a lot of kids turkey hunting, and, I have twin 10-year-old daughters. One of them is phenomenal at details and paying attention in the woods, and one of them is oblivious. And that's partially their wiring, but I'm used to them. But I took one of my nephews out who's, I don't know, I think he's 11 or 12. His first turkey hunt. He's never done it. He had deer hunted with his dad a little bit, rifle hunted. And I'm telling you, every sound we heard in the woods, he was like, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" Like he had no, and it's stuff that we hear. Like you don't even acknowledge like blue jays flying overhead or pileated woodpecker or whatever flying by. It's just like so part of the landscape. To him, he was just, holy cow! I don't know what any of it, and it was like kind of an eye opener for me.
Yeah, and we only spend a few hours a week out in the woods compared to a deer spending 24 hours a day out there.
Yeah. I mean, it's a different thing. So when you talk about their ears and pinpointing stuff, when you say that, what it reminds me of is when you deer hunt a lot, you sort of intuitively learn. I mean, you probably learn just from your mistakes that if a deer's looking in your direction, you don't call. If like when you're bow hunting, because they're going to be on you in a second, but you wait till they turn their head and those ears are turned the other way, then you call, and it just feels like that's the right move.
Right. Or even if they're looking in your direction and the ears are turned back, which they have the ability to hear, listen behind them.
Yeah.
But that's another thing to think about while you're deer hunting is watching the deer's ear. Because, if you're watching the deer's ear, you can tell what that deer's thinking about as well. And, if they all of a sudden they're cupping their ears behind them, they're hearing something that they want more information on. It might be another deer. It might be something they're trying to identify what that is. So it's time for you to pay attention to what's going on behind the deer.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was curious about with you is how much, like how many ideas for your research do you get just from sitting in the woods and hunting deer? Because like when you talk about like that right there, one of the things I always think is so cool, if you watch a deer, that's chomping on some acorns or maybe eating a corn cob in the field or something, and they think they hear something, you watch them stop chewing. And it's the same thing people do. Like if somebody speaks to you and you got a mouthful of Cheerios or whatever, you stop chewing for a second so you can hear, and you see those little behaviors. Like how often have you been in your life just sitting out in the woods and saw like a little thing like that and went, you know what? And then it sparks some kind of idea for you.
Well, I think that happens, quite often. I don't know if I can give you a specific instance on it, but just watching deer behavior, I'm always asking the question, why is that deer doing what that deer is doing, instead of just accepting the fact that it is doing that. And I think that makes the difference in trying to answer and trying to figure out, a lot of the questions we asked.
Yeah. I mean, I tell people, we get hit with questions constantly on like, what scent should I buy? What call should I buy? Like, it's always like, what can you tell me to get me closer to dead bucks? And I'm always like, pay attention to deer, figure out where they like to walk, figure out why they like to walk there, and then go shoot them. And they don't want to hear it.
They don't want to hear it. They want to buy a crutch instead of going out there and actually learning the animal. And that's what I'm a minimalist when it comes to hunting. I generally have either my bow and an arrow or a gun and a couple shells, and that's about all I carry to the woods with me. I use my mouth to make any calls that I want to make, but I don't like to carry a lot of gear because it kind of takes away from the hunt to me.
Yeah, I'm a minimalist too. I like simple. I like just trying to figure out what makes them tick and try to capitalize on that. Let's back up 1 second. There's something I wanted to ask you about. So when you mentioned, the frequency in which we hear versus the frequency in which we think deer hear, it's a little bit different.
Yeah,
Why?
just a little bit.
Why? I mean, where's the evolutionary divergence there?
You know what that might be? It might be that, the deer that we tested were, 4, 5, 6 years old or something. Most times humans, when they're being tested, they're, 20 years old. And, we lose some of our ability to hear higher frequencies. And it might be just something that over time that the subjects themselves have lost their ability to hear high frequencies. I can't hear high pitches like I used to anymore. So that might be part of it. Whether or not there's an evolutionary significance to it. Heck, I don't know. Some of the calls that they deer make, the call and alarm, that's a higher pitch, higher frequency sound. It might be a little bit easier for them to hear that sound, to follow but I don't think it's not such a major difference between the deer and the human that there's really that much to really, I don't know, there's not that much to really try to put together an evolutionary picture for it.
Yeah. It might not mean anything.
Yeah, it's not that different.
Yeah. I mean, or it might, when I hear stuff like that, I always wonder, you mentioned like a deer snorting, an alarm, or, you know, maybe it's tied to coyote howls or some predator, the pitch of some predator's call or something at some point, or it just could be just the way things shook out. You know,
well, that's a good way to say it. I wish I would have said it that way.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. Has anybody, so when you talk about how a whitetail, you know, we know how they use their ears, you know, we know what they're doing with them. Has anybody ever studied mule deer in the same capacity?
Not that I know of, but it would make sense. Obviously, with those larger ears, they have a bit, you know, and it's a greater enhanced ability to capture some of that sound and maybe to localize that sound as well. But,
yeah, and do you think that would come from just maybe being in a more open, bigger terrain or something?
Yeah, you know, distances are much greater in those situations, and sound carries further. You know, in a closed forest situation, the whitetail lives up close and personal, whereas a mule deer lives, you know, his experience is much broader of what he's visualizing or hearing.
Yeah, it's just a different thing. Anything besides the obvious, you know, metal on metal sounds, maybe like, you know, a too tight tree strap on the wrong tree bark can really make a nasty sound. Anything that like you personally, when you're hunting, because of your research on deer hearing, are you just like, I can't make that noise, or when you make it, you're like, oh, that's terrible?
You know, one of the sounds that kind of falls right into the peak of the deer's hearing capability is kind of the rustle sound you make when your clothing moves, you move against a tree, that brush, and some types of fabrics make an awful lot of noise. And that's one of the things I work with Sitka on, Sitka Camo on, is developing some of this, you know, helping them develop some of their camo based on deer's hearing capabilities. And they're trying to minimize the sound that those camos make. And, I think that's critically important. You know, you just don't hear nylon naturally out in the woods, you know?
Yeah, or Velcro.
Or Velcro, you know, any of those types of things. Any unnatural sound is going to be picked up pretty quickly.
Yeah. It's interesting when you see. It's interesting when you could like walk down the aisle of a Cabela's or wherever and look at the different camo and look at all the different bino harnesses and the different clasps and Velcro and all the stuff. And then over the years you go out and hunt and you just realize, like, if I'm wearing this kind of jacket, I can't turn with my back to a tree when the deer are close. Like, well, if I stand up, I got to stand up with my back away. Or you have some stuff that you can kind of ride that right up that bark and it's not going to make any noise. And it's little stuff like that. I think when you get a lot of bow hunting experience, you just start to intuitively go, I'm going to green light that and I'm never going to wear this again, kind of stuff.
Right. And that fabric choice and the noise that fabric makes might be more important than the actual camo that you're using. You know, pick your camo up with your ears, not your eyes.
Yep. I want to ask you one more thing about deer hearing before we move on. So when I asked you about the frequency in which they hear and in which we hear, and we kind of decided it might not mean anything at all, you mentioned, as you get older, we're like very aware that, our hearing can go downhill, right? Like we're very aware that our eyesight at a certain age, like you're going to need your cheater glasses. Like we don't think about animals in terms like that. I don't ever think about an old buck, having any diminished sense of hearing or any diminished sense of vision. Do you think that happens? I mean,
none of the studies have looked at an age relationship to that, or have found an age relationship to that. We didn't notice any difference in any of our study animals as related to age. It's possible, but think about this: you're dealing with a 6-year span between a fawn and a mature buck, versus a 70-year span between, a young child and a older man.
Well, and you would have to account for the fact that even if there was some level of diminishment there, they're also layering in an extra year of survival experience and encounters, and so they would probably more than offset anything like that. I've never thought about it that way.
Yeah, well, also think about, where do we lose our hearing? From listening to too many chainsaws, rock and rolls, or gunshots, right?
Yeah.
Where our vision is based on watching computers screens, we lose it. Deer don't do any of that stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, that's true. And in one very specific instance, I can say you can lose some hearing if your dipshit buddy shoots a 12 gauge right by your ear when a grouse flies over, and your ears will never stop ringing again. So that's a bummer. And they don't have that happen very often to them, I guess. So
occasionally they'll have a gunshot that, if somebody happens to miss, but if they're lucky, they got that gunshot, right?
Yep. Let's talk about. So I think if you were gonna just like rank them, if you're gonna ask hunters like, okay, what's the scent, or what's the sense you want to avoid the most? I think people would waffle back and forth between eyesight and hearing. Like you don't want to get spotted, you don't want deer to hear you doing something dumb, but the nose is the one you want to beat. And the nose is the one that's probably the hardest for us to understand, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but you know what? I've thought a lot. I've asked that question and had that question asked to me. I think probably the most important one that I would want to beat is their sense of vision, and particularly with their ability to detect movement. And that is the toughest one. The sense of smell is easy to beat. All you have to be is downwind of the deer, and you beat it, right? So that's the trick. It's not how do you mask your odor. It's just don't present your odor into a place where you expect the deer to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I would look at that maybe a little bit differently. So yes, if you're sitting in your tree stand and your scent blows to that deer, you're in trouble. Right. But we're also like, I'm super into training bird dogs and working with dogs, and like I'm fascinated by their ability to smell stuff. Right.
Oh, no question. It's we can't even fathom what they appreciate through their nose.
No, I don't think we could even in a million years. We're not even anywhere near it. But so what I think about is, yes, we have two tasks with whitetails a lot of times, right? The immediate moment of the hunt where you're like, I don't want him to smell me, or it's over, or whoever, whatever deer's going by. But we're also leaving residual scent out there. And I feel like we educate them that way, to a level that we probably can't really appreciate.
That's conceivable, but there's also coyotes and everything else walking through those woods that are potential predators for them. That's leaving their scent in different places. How important is it for a deer to know that something was there versus something is there? Yeah. And I think the most important aspect is something is there, right?
Yeah.
So if it's an older scent that we've left, and deer can very likely tell the age of scents as well, and it's clearly they can tell the difference in the age of a track that another deer left or that a predator left, and very likely a human as well.
Yep. Well, so I wonder about that because the evaporation level of the scent, like knowing which direction you were going, how long ago you were there, like they're really figuring out a lot of stuff with dogs on that front, which is fascinating. Like everybody's like, how does a dog know when I'm coming home from work? And it's like, it's a condition from, being left at home every day, and they know your scent smells at this strength now at 5 o'clock at night. So you're coming home, know, and I when I hear stuff like that, I always try to think about it in like a deer's world, but there's just so much going on there. But when I heard you on Bo's podcast, I would, if you would have asked me before I listened to you say this, I would have said scent, their olfactory abilities, that is predator detection. That's like a major thing for him. But you actually said that it's more about food and communication.
Yeah, and I would still say that predator, the sense of smell is tremendous for predator detection if the predator is in the right place. If the predator is approaching from downwind, the sense of smell is totally useless for the deer, right? So, but the other aspect is the sense of smell that people don't appreciate is, deer have to find food, basically that's what they're doing is all day long is foraging. And how do they find that food? They don't find that food by looking for it. They don't pick up an acorn to look and see if it's a good acorn versus a bad acorn. They smell the difference, right? And if you ever sat on a deer stand and, watched them eating acorns, you don't see them looking for acorns. They're snuffing. You can actually hear them, snuffing in the leaves for the acorns. So they're detecting what they're going to pick on, what they're going to eat based on the sense of smell. Frankly, their eyes for that up close vision are not that good anyways. So they probably have a harder time finding an acorn with their eyes than we would.
Yeah, because their eyesight's not wired for that.
And then on top of that, they don't go around with a dendrology book trying to identify different plants and different leaves based on the shape of their leaves and stuff like that. They know what it's supposed to eat and what they're not supposed to eat by the smell of those plants, And some plants have different compounds in them called anti-herbivory compounds, like tannins and so forth, that deer can pick up on with their sense of smell or their sense of taste, and they can reject those in deference to other plants. And you probably even noticed that deer can tell something they pick the young growth, or deer can even pick out something that's been fertilized versus something that's not been fertilized, because there's something different about that plant. And that's not by vision, that's by the sense of smell. That sense of smell is incredibly important for them for foraging.
Yeah, they can probably differentiate like levels of ripeness in fruit. They can probably differentiate, like to some extent, like micronutrient levels in different stuff, huh?
Certainly, yeah. I don't think there's any question about that.
How do you study that?
I don't know that you do.
So we're just guessing?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I started out my career looking a lot with deer scent communication and deer sense of smell and stuff like that. And that's why we switched to hearing and vision, because it got a lot easier to do those studies. Because the sense of smell, there's so many aspects of this, so many variables that come into play with working with the sense of smell. And we really have no appreciation for what the deer smells, for even a comparison studies. So, how do you study those things? Sometimes you maybe not even need to study them. Just good observation can tell you some of this stuff of what's going on, right? You don't have to have a controlled scientific experiment to know that if you fertilize your azaleas in your front yard, a deer is going to end up eating your azaleas, right? Mm-hmm. Which would tell you that deer can tell the difference. So, and it's even interesting, just observations like there are times of year when deer will forage on different types of plants. There's a lot of plants that in the fall time, the deer will, they won't utilize those plants all summer long. And then comes sometime in late August or early into September, they'll start really hitting those types of plants. What's changed? Are the deer hungrier? I don't think so. I think what has changed is something's changed about those plants. And as those plants are go into senescence, they're deciduous plants, maybe they're losing their, those secondary compounds that are those toxic compounds that are, causing deer to avoid them. Or maybe the sugar levels are going up because of they're transporting some of those sugars, into the root system. So there's differences that are occurring physiologically in those plants that deer are able to pick up with. And they're doing that with their sense of smell.
After 3 years of work, our follow-up to the Meat Eater Fish and Game Cookbook is here. It's the Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, campfire, and camp stove. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside, from grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Get your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com or buy it wherever books are sold.
Do you think, because when you talk about like a sugar content of, certain plants after the first hard frost or something like that, or, a ripe apple versus an early green one, that's just not the same thing. Do you think that because we eat off of taste, right? Like we just do. Like we're not, most of us aren't paying attention to like micronutrient levels and stuff like that while we're eating and trying to have like a truly balanced diet that way. Right. But we do also kind of like inherently sometimes crave things that our body needs. You know, like if you go into the Elk Mountains for 10 days, you know, on day 8, you have a different, like you have a different desire for food. Like even if you've kept yourself well fed with whatever calorie amount you needed and you weren't in a big deficit, you're still like, man, I want a salad and a bacon cheeseburger. Like there's something your body, or pregnant women, like
I was just going to say a pregnant woman.
yeah, those crave, like there's a reason they're eating chalk, and it's not because they're sitting here going, like, I really like the taste of chalk just once in a while. They're going, the body is saying something. So I wonder about deer, because we always focus on like the taste aspect. It's like, oh, they're gonna hit the brassicas now because it got to 10 degrees last night and the sugar content or whatever. But I wonder how much of that is just tied to them inherently or instinctively knowing, I need more of this, I need more of that, I need like I need this to be healthy, and they're probably not aware of it.
Yeah. And it could be. I think, is it an either or a both and? I think it's a both and. The change in the taste probably affects them as well. Well, think about one that's, very clear they're craving for salt. And they only crave salt during certain times of the year. That's during the spring and early summer when vegetation is very succulent. They're taking in a lot of water content, which means they're urinating a lot, which means they're losing a lot of sodium. And that's what's driving their salt use, is a sodium deficit that most herbivores are running against.
Just because of the seasonal timing, and they're flushing out their system more.
Right. Because there's so much, they're taking in so much of that moisture in that young succulent vegetation. They're not drinking that much water. They're just having to get rid of a lot of water, which means you're going to get rid of a lot of sodium as well.
So that's not tied to antler growth or anything like that, huh?
Not necessarily. No. And it's probably, there's also some aspect of fetal growth in there as well, in that springtime. So, but, we've seen some really neat movement patterns of deer in response to this sodium drive as well, where we had a study up in West Virginia a number of years ago where we had a bunch of radio-collared does. And on this study area, these does would, for about a week or two, would just disappear. And it generally occurred sometime in May or June. And then about 2 weeks later, they'd come back. And this was before the days of GPS. So we ended up having to go around, really drive around and find these does. And it turned out a lot of these does were going to some old gas wells where there was a pool of water out in front of these old gas wells. And we took some measurements of that water, and it had really high sodium levels in it. So these does would go, and sometimes they would go miles to pick up, and camp out for a week or two at these sodium sources, and then come back and to their home range. So it's kind of interesting that there's two aspects of that are kind of neat. Is one, of deer have an ability to recycle sodium in their body, so they're picking up that sodium load and they're and keeping it. But the question is, how did they find it?
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. How the hell do they find that?
Well, and as well, it's interesting that some of the deer did this and some of the deer didn't. And, we don't know this for sure, but it's very likely that some of the deer that actually went to these sodium sources must have been deer that have dispersed at some time, or their ancestors dispersed at some time into this new area. But when these does went, a lot of times in June or even into July, a lot of times they took their yearlings with them, and sometimes they took their fawns with them. So they were learning this like a migration pattern. They learned this and so it becomes a cultural knowledge in that deer herd among some of the deer that, hey, we go get our sodium and at this place.
So do you think there's any way, this is going to be super woo-woo, there's any way that there's like an ancestral sort of memory or something there that a deer, let's say that you take a 2-year-old doe that's never been shown one of those spots, could she know? Like, I mean, we could never know, right?
Yeah, and I don't think she could know.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make that sense that she knew, because why didn't some of the other deer do it? But you think about it, back in the pre-Columbian days, before the white man got here, there were places where there were kind of mass migrations of herbivores to some of these sodium areas. They called them salt licks, and there's a number of different places you hear about Deer Run Lick or something, Salt Creek or something like that. All kinds of places, particularly across the eastern United States. And those were places where the Indians and later the early settlers set up to go kill deer, because they knew the deer were going to be coming to these things. So it must be something that they learned through time.
Yeah.
And there were migrations to these sodium sources.
Well, yeah, I mean, we bring sort of a modern spin to that study you're talking about, where you think about the source, it's a man-made source, and you don't think about it the same way as you do a natural salt lick out there somewhere where generations of deer would find it or be around it or be aware of it in proximity to where their home range is or whatever. But it's really like, the deer don't care that was not natural. Like, they don't give a shit if it was whoever put it there. It doesn't matter to them. That's like a thing that they find and they know they need, and a certain percentage of them pass that knowledge on, and that's just how it happens.
Right. And, in most places, we don't see that drive anymore, or those movements in response to salt, because there's salt everywhere. Hunters are putting out salt, every 300 acre spot got, a couple salt blocks on it, and there's salt on roadsides, for after winter time. So, there's just lots of salt available for deer now.
Yeah. It's just not a limited resource for them anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you, when you mentioned earlier that studying how a deer, how good is a deer's nose and how does it work? You mentioned how challenging that was, and it kind of motivates you to go study some other senses a little bit more.
Yeah. But one of the things we didn't study how good a deer's nose is. We studied more on the different glands that deer had and how they utilize those glands for communication and such, and identifying some of the chemical analysis of those glands. But, there's been just a couple studies that actually kind of tried to approach this idea of how well a deer can smell compared to a human. And one of the ways they did that is by actually counting the number of sensory receptors in the nose.
Yep.
You can find widely different estimates on this thing based in the scientific literature and on in the popular magazines as well. And it was one time believed that humans only had about 5 million receptors. Now the thoughts are that somewhere between 10 and 50 million receptors. But there was a study done on whitetails back in the 90s, and I think they came up with something like 300 million back there. But that's probably a low estimate, and that number very likely, if it's comparable to some of the stuff we know about dogs now, it might be over 1 billion.
Yeah.
Of different receptors. So just the structure of the nose of the human compared to the structure of the nose of the deer, speaks to how well they can smell.
Yeah.
But one thing I don't think people really appreciate that much, though, is that to smell a particular smell, you need a receptor site that's keyed to that scent. It's not just there's just a random any receptor site can pick up any odor. It's got to have a match between the receptor site and the odor. So the receptor sites are probably built around what scents are important to deer too, versus a human's receptors might be built around what's important to human. So it's actually conceivable, but there may be some odors that humans could smell better than deer. It's conceivable. I don't know what that might be, but the point is that there are so many receptor sites on deer, and very likely a lot of them are keyed into some of these highly volatile compounds that are dispersed by the wind, that are for predator avoidance, as well as some of the things associated with the food resources too. So deer are very likely able to pick up on some scents that we can't even smell, period, regardless of their concentration.
Yeah. Well, wouldn't it be, doesn't it make sense to say then that, sure, like we smell gasoline, right? You get gasoline on your hands, we know that scent, we know what it means. A deer, without question, could probably smell gasoline. It probably just doesn't matter to them. It might just be like a curious scent, but in their worldview, they probably really don't, it probably doesn't register as much of, probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, that kind of brings up the idea, if you smell something, do you have an innate response to it, or is it a learned response to it? And most smells, you respond to that based on a learned behavior. So a deer learns what smells may be bad or what smells are good. They must learn the smell of a predator from their mother. Do they inherently fear a predator? There might be some aspect of that, but I think how many times you can train a deer to walk up to a human. We train them all the time. They're not afraid of the smell of a human inherently. they learn that. And you look at, suburban and urban deer, they're not afraid of the smell of a human, so it's much more of a learned behavior, which things are important and which things are not important to them.
Yeah. You think about that from the perspective of if a fawn out there, when mom bumps into the scent of, a coyote just went through or a wolf or something just went through, her reaction that, we don't think about communication in body language nearly as much as we probably should. You do a lot when you train dogs, but there's an entire lesson with every encounter that they're just through osmosis, man, they're just taking that in. And we don't think about it that way. We think of it as something inherent, but you're right. I mean, it probably, all of that stuff's learned.
Right. And I think a lot of it, like you said, is learned through body language, how the dam responds to something that the fawn learns to respond that way as well. And there are just so many subtle things that deer do that most humans, if you aren't trained, your eyes not trained to it, you don't see the deer actually doing that. I learned a lot from my wife, she's trained horses all her life, and she can tell what a horse is thinking just by what that horse is posture, ear posture, and stuff like that. So, I translate a lot of that into, deer as well.
Yeah. That world, it's so fascinating. I mean, when you talk about, dog training, I hate to keep going back to this, but, we have 25,000 years of coevolution, and we haven't been able to speak to each other. And yet we can do a lot of really cool stuff. We can speak to a dog, right? But it's not, It's not you and I having a conversation. And yet they can figure out a hell of a lot about what we want just by how we move and how we look and eye contact and all that stuff. And then you think about these animals out there and social animals like deer living together. There's so much going on and so much behavior that we really don't get to observe. Like we think we do as hunters. We're like, oh, we're pretty clued into this scrape behavior or fighting, and then you think, well, how often do you actually watch two bucks really fight or two does, get up on their hind legs and swat each other? It's pretty rare. And when you do, you're getting a lesson in body language every time.
Right. But a lot of times you see there's precursors to that and all types of body language that's being used. And many times it's avoided because of those precursors.
Yep. Yeah. You see them, kind of bump up a little bit, but they don't, somebody wins without having to win.
Right. Because, if you're going to get into a fight, that becomes risky for you. Why take that risk if you can just use an eardrop or something like that to avoid it?
Yeah. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier about, calling to a deer that's looking away versus calling towards you and just paying attention to deer behavior. I mean, every time you have two bucks square up around you or, kind of bump up against one another and they're not going to fight, but they're doing something. They're, they're working on each other a little bit, or you watch that dominant doe in the little kill plot and that 1.5-year-old doe tries to come in and you see just a subtle hunch, she's saying something. It teaches you so much about how you need to interact with them. Like if you like to call or like what level of interaction you're going to have with that specific deer that morning as he's walking by. Like, does he look like a deer who's going to be callable? Like, is he going to be susceptible to a snort wheeze or is he going to be gonzo?
Yeah. Or even, attending grunt is, I've had bucks that I knew were there. I learned this a long time ago that there are times to use a tending grunt and times not to. And the peak of the rut is not the time to use a tending grunt because most of the bucks out there have a doe with them. So if they're already on a hot doe and you use an aggressive grunt or a tending grunt or something like that, they're not going to come to fight. They're going to take that doe and turn her away and go the other direction, right?
Yep.
So, I use a grunt before and after the peak of the rut, but not actually during the peak of the rut.
Yeah, me too. I really like early season when you see the right situation. Like I killed a buck in Minnesota, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And he came out and there was already 2 little bucks out in the field. And just kind of the way he was around him, I was like, I'm going to grunt this dude in and kill him. And it took like 5 contact grunts. And you could just see him he was just like, I don't want to be, I'm not going to let anybody who's in this field talk to me that way. Like you could just see, and part of it was the way he was interacting with those other bucks. And he came in and I shot him. And it was like it was just one of those moments where you just look at it and you go, this is the guy. Like, it's like that hot 2-year-old turkey that you run into that hits your, as soon as you yelp, he gobbles, you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah, it's over.
Yeah, this one's coming. Man, let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about deer management. What's going on? What's the future of the whitetail? I'm going to give you a really hard question because there's a million things we could go, but how do you feel about the future of whitetails?
Boy, that's a $1,000 question, isn't it?
Well, hey, let me rephrase that. Are we going to be hunting whitetails in 50 years?
Yeah, here, I've often thought of this question, and how I would respond if I was asked this question. The whitetail, from the time we started restoring whitetail deer over 100 and some years ago, has always had issues that biologists and hunters have had to get through to get us to where we are. So, at one time there weren't any deer. Then we went through the restoration phase, and then we ended up with, in many places, we went through the overpopulation phase, in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Michigan, all throughout the New England states. And, there's always been a different phase that we've gone through. Some of them have been easier to surmount, and some of them haven't. The whitetail is facing a number of challenges right now. And one of the biggest challenges, of course, is CWD, which I know you've done a podcast on. Yep. But that one is a major issue, because right now there's nothing in the foreseeable future that's going to stop it. So it's going to be ubiquitous across the whitetails range someday. Very likely will be. And it's going to affect deer populations, and it's going to affect deer hunters and the number of hunters. And I think the number of hunters is a very important aspect of this. We've already seen over the last couple of decades a decline in the numbers of hunters. The recruitment and retention of hunters has gone down pretty dramatically over the last couple of decades, which that supports the funding for agencies and so forth. So, when the money starts to dry up, then the management starts to decrease, and, you get a vicious cycle here. So that's a tough one to deal with, although, if there was a bright spot to COVID, that COVID actually put a bunch of people in the woods when you couldn't do, anything else. So there was a bump up, and then, this idea with the local boar, the hunters, recruiting new hunters, it's a good movement in the right direction, So I think that one's being addressed. The CWD issue, that's also going to affect populations. Areas where you have high productivity, like where it is in Wisconsin and stuff like that, in places like that, high productivity, you can manage around it. Although we might not be managing for the mature bucks, because those are the ones that have the highest prevalence rates, right? But in some areas where you got inherently low productivity deer herds, throwing CWD on top of that could be a pretty strong population influence driving those populations down.
Yeah.
But so that's one major. Let me mention one other major issue as well that I see, particularly in the eastern United States, is the changing predator context that the whitetail lives in now. We didn't have coyotes. We do have coyotes. Bear populations where bears occur are at an all-time high or historical high, and both of those are tremendous predators on fawns. And in some areas like the southern Appalachians, they're driving deer populations down to the point where right now we just are finishing up a study in North Georgia where the survival rate is incredibly low of fawns. And it's mostly due to predation by bears and coyotes, to the point where even eliminating antlerless harvest completely, those populations aren't going to recover unless there's something that can be done to increase fawn recruitment. In most areas where we have good productivity, we can deal with fawn predation aspects by predators by reducing antlerless harvest. But there are some areas where we're not going to be able to do that, and those deer populations are going to be difficult to deal with. Places in Georgia, North Georgia mountains, where we historically had some of our earliest deer hunting was done up there. The number of hunters is incredibly low now, just because the deer are gone.
And so this is probably, I'm guessing there's some people listening to this who are young enough where they don't really understand that what you're talking about here is they're deer herds that haven't historically had coyotes to deal with. Like this
Right.
is a new thing. Like if you look at the history of coyotes, where they came from in the Southwest and have been pushed farther out into the country, and they've expanded, and they're we talk about the adaptability of whitetails, which is incredible in the diverse environments they can take hold of and be pretty fecund in there. When you look at the story of the coyote, that's incredible. That's like, think of them what you will. They are an incredible survival machine. And, you look at their diet they eat everything from scorpions on up, and you'll see them eating apples and stuff sometimes off your stand. Like, they're crazy.
Right.
And now you've got these populations of deer, that have been there for generations and generations, and they're dealing with a predator that they don't have that ancestral kind of, knowledge or, survival skills to deal with. And then you throw in bear populations on the rise, and how good they are at chomping fawns for the first, X amount of weeks that they're dropped. And it's a sort of a rough picture.
Yeah. When you think about it, I don't think until some of the last decade or two, when the research was done in Pennsylvania, here, Georgia, and a number of places across the country, how effective both bears and coyotes are when it comes to taking fawns. But you think about it, for 7 to 14 days or more, you got these little protein packets laying out all over the woods. All they have to do is pick them up. And I remember one time a few years ago up in Pennsylvania, I was up there right during the peak of the fawning, and in some of the forests, there's a lot of hay-scented fern, a lot of fern cover on the ground. And I saw a place where a bear had gone through and had actually worked a grid pattern, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, looking for fawns at that time. And that bear could do that all day long. How many fawns is he going to encounter? Certainly there's going to be several of them,
Yeah. Well, I think that I've talked about this on here a few times. They studied fawn mortality in the county I hunt over in northern Wisconsin, and it was pretty dismal. It was 90% of the fawns were killed in the first 11 months, and like 2/3 of those were predation, and the bears were the number one predator. And you're talking a place with a high prevalence of, you've got bears, coyotes, you got some wolves there, not a ton, but you got bobcats. You got things that can chomp on fawns, and bears are so good at it.
When you said 90%, was it 90% of the fawns that were born died, or 90% of the mortality of fawns was based on predators?
They were dead. So no. So 90% of the fawns they studied were dead within the first 11 months, and 2/3 of those were predator related. Right. Yeah. So, it's one county. It's but it to me it was an eye opener, because it's the only place I ever hunt where I just incidentally see bears quite often. Like, there's a lot of them there. And, we've always had trouble with deer. Like, you just don't have very many of them. And you start seeing that connection. And then you think about, something I want to ask you about is, like, you take that just for what it is. If you hunt in the big woods up north, you're like, okay, I'm around these predators that have just kind of always been here. Right. Like, the wolf populations have changed, and we know that story, but generally they've had the deer have a rough go of it up there. But now you talk about, you're talking about Georgia, and you're talking about the Southeast, and you're talking about places where, like, these predators haven't been, the coyotes haven't been there. The bears have probably been there, but not to the extent they are. So, and now, and how people like to talk about, there's bobcats everywhere, or there's mountain lions making it into this spot. Why are the predators doing so well in these places?
Bear populations are doing well because bear harvest has been restricted enough to allow the bear populations to recover. To the point is, actually in some places like North Georgia mountains, you can take multiple bears now. The point is, after you shoot one bear, particularly up in those mountains, and you have to get it out of there, how many bears do you need to kill in your lifetime? It's not like you're going out and killing deer for the freezer and stuff. So the harvest has not matched the population growth, and the population growth, based on what our research has shown over the last several decades, is continuing to increase in the bear population. So the coyotes have been extremely successful, particularly here in the Southeast, because we have such varied habitats, from urban, suburban, agricultural, different types of forest types, all interspersed together. There's plenty for a coyote to eat, because they'll eat just about anything. And we probably have higher coyote densities here than most places you'd ever expect to find coyotes. Maybe similar to South Texas. So when you got that high a density of coyotes out there, and then just for a brief time, you have all these fawns hit the ground, they're going to key in on those things because it's a very easy thing for them to find. And particularly, it's easy for them to catch some of that stuff and carry it back to the pups in the den, because those things are happening at the same time. They're raising pups, they can carry these little protein packets back.
Yep.
You know, it's not picture that versus going out and trying to catch a bunch of mice and carrying them back to your pups. You know, they're going to key on those fawns.
Yeah, when we're really hungry, we gravitate toward calorie dense food, which is why we eat a lot of junk food. But we don't think about that the same way. If you're a coyote out there and you can work all day to catch a bunch of grasshoppers, or you can work all day and find one fawn, you know what you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, if there was a market for coyotes, or if there's right now, the highest mortality of coyotes in Georgia and most of the Southeast are hunter harvested coyotes. There's a lot of people hunting coyotes. And then the roadkills are the other major influence. But you think of one coyote producing, 5, 6, 7, 8 pups versus a fawn, a doe producing 1 to maybe 2 fawns. It's kind of disproportionate there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, we don't have the trapping that we used to, it's just, we just generally don't. That's such an effective way to control coyotes and some of the other predators. And I think, I don't know about where you live, but so I live in the suburbs of the Twin Cities, and these people around me, like my wife's friends, they have no clue about nature. Like, no, they just don't. So when everybody started getting like Ring doorbell cameras and, like the surveillance cameras that a lot of people have, or, a lot of people will put out a trail camera on their bird feeder or whatever now, so it's like, they're seeing, oh my God, there's coyotes everywhere. I'm like, yeah, you can freaking hear them. I hear coyotes all the time right out my front door. And now the bear thing, it's like, oh my God, we have bears. And I'm like, now you see bears.
Now
like,
you're seeing.
You didn't understand that how, like we think of these animals as sort of being out in the wild. Like a bear. A bear's a prime example, right? Like when the average person thinks of a bear, they think of it in the big woods out in the wild, and you see it in this beautiful place or whatever, and they're living in your backyard, eating in your bird feeder, and digging up like bees nests and stuff on the soccer field. Like they're living there right there with us with these deer, and their populations are doing really well, and we kind of don't seem to really recognize how detrimental that can be until it catches up to our deer populations, and by then you're in a really reactive state. It's rough.
Yeah, and the other thing is the deer populations have done the same thing. They were the first ones to move into the suburbs, in the urban suburban areas, and now these other things are following them in there because, frankly, there's nothing for them to fear. And that's a whole concept in ecology called the ecology of fear, and fear is a very important driver on animals' behavior. Fear of being predated on. What does a coyote have to fear in the suburbs? Maybe the front end of a Ford or something, but that's about it. Deer in the suburbs don't have anything to fear. Now bears are getting into the same situation. They're not hunted in these situations, so they have no fear of humans. And with having no fear of humans, they're going to coexist with humans.
Yeah. And I think that we really underestimate how good they are at not showing themselves to us.
Mm-hmm.
They're masters of staying hidden. Karl, we are just about out of time. So I got one question I want to ask you. In all the research you've done, and it's been a ton, you've learned a ton, you've contributed so much to this space. What's the question that that keeps you up at night that you want to learn about deer? Like, what's one thing that you're like, I wish if you could wave a magic wand and you could study it and probably come to an answer, what would it be?
Well, I'll tell you what, it comes back to what we were talking about. If I could do like Spock with a Vulcan mind meld, get inside of deer's brain, I think there's just really getting a feel for what they're experiencing when they're experiencing sensory inputs from either their eyes or their nose. Because we've done a lot of that stuff with the deer vision and stuff like that, and we got a good feel for what they see. But we can say it's something, but we can't experience that. So that'd be the neatest thing, is be able to experience what they actually experience when they're visualizing something. Or either whether a deer or a dog, like you said, I've trained dogs all my life as well, scent dogs, and just the world that they live in in this world of aromas, world of chemicals is just fascinating. We have absolutely no appreciation for it.
Yeah, I know that drives me nuts too. I just wish. I mean, when you think about if you're standing in a cattail slough and you just look around and you like all the details you see, like if you're pheasant hunting, like all just visually what you can pick up, and then think about if you could do that with your nose, close your eyes and perceive that much different stuff going on, but do it with your nose. It's so crazy.
Yeah. So you asked me earlier a question. I don't know if you got a second or not, but which scent would the deer most likely not want to lose? That idea about the sense of smell. If it's related to predation, that's one aspect. But I think a deer without a sense of smell would have a hard time surviving. I think a blind deer could survive better than a deer without a sense of smell.
Because of the communication, or because of the predators?
The communication and food.
Oh.
A blind deer can find something to eat, but a deer without a nose is going to have a hard time.
Yeah. 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 You don't think about that. Karl, this has been so much fun, man. I'm so glad I got to talk to you and have you on here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a quick hour, I'll tell you.
Well, we'll do it again.
More than welcome to.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And that's it for this week, folks. Be sure to tune in next week for some more whitetail-y goodness. This has been Wired to Hunt, and I'm your guest host, Tony Peterson. As always, I just want to thank you so much for listening and so much for your support. And if you're in the market for a little bit more whitetail content, you can head on over to themeateater.com/wired. Again, that's themeateater.com/wired. And you'll see a pile of new articles by guys like Bo Martonic and Andy May and myself and Mark, whole bunch of them. And if you want more, you can head over to our YouTube channel as well. If those articles aren't enough, we have a Wired to Hunt YouTube channel, and we drop weekly how-to videos there as well.
After 3 years of work, our follow-up to the Meat Eater Fish and Game Cookbook is here. It's the Meat Eater Outdoor Cookbook, wild game recipes for the grill, smoker, campfire, and camp stove. Here is your book for everything that's best cooked or eaten outside. From grilling to open fire cooking to Dutch ovens to smokers to barbecue to backpacking meals to how to pull off the perfect fish fry, with pit stops along the way for lessons about Ice Age cooking methods and the best 5 ways to construct a cooking fire you can be proud of. And of course, we're focusing on wild game and fish here with over 100 recipes, including stuffed venison burgers 3 ways, wild duck with ahi verde sauce, a jerky made with cola, a gin and tonic made with fire-charred lemons, and grilled frog legs made with a sticky sweet sauce. This ain't your normal cookbook, so be prepared to be surprised. Get your copy now. For more info, visit themeateater.com or buy it wherever books are sold.